Right, so I hope you've had a chance to have a think about whether you agree about this strange new world that Sister Mary Clare talked about and Phyllis Tickle and Vincent Donovan started to see in his work with the Maasai. Keep those questions in mind and we'll continue discussion later on, probably. Okay, so now let me play you a little tongue-in-cheek kind of video which just describes what a fresh expression of church is. I love that video because it's so simple and to the point, and it bears watching quite a bit to get your head around exactly what we mean by fresh expressions of church. Once that church report was released and sold all those 30,000 copies, there began to be an explosion of creativity across the UK and beyond in terms of how we could be a different kind of church in different cultural contexts with different groups of people. And there was loads of variety happening, and there, you can just see some pictures on the screen now of some of the sorts of things that began to be happening. And of course, actually, for many people, they'd already been doing this. They'd already been reaching out to different groups of people in different cultures and growing communities, Christian communities in those cultures. But they hadn't actually necessarily had a language for it before, or known that what they were doing was something that God was doing. And some of those people who were doing those things were perhaps belittled for it, or clergy or others around them perhaps thought that what they were doing wasn't from God. But one thing that the report did was it sort of lent a kind of authority to these things and made it clearer that this is part of what God has been doing all along and an important part. So I think a lot of people were affirmed in what they were already doing, and other people were encouraged to try something new. The whole point of these fresh expressions is that we can get to the point where who Jesus is, the theological word for that is Christology, who Christ is, who Jesus is shapes our mission, our missiology, which then shapes what our churches look like, our ecclesiology, all the ology words there. So where our Christology shapes our missiology, which then shapes our ecclesiology. So who Jesus is shapes our mission, which then shapes what our churches look like. Instead of what we currently have, which is often what our churches look like, shaping what we think our mission is and who we think Jesus is. So that's why you ended up with, I think I referred last time we met to some of the overseas missionaries in the 1800s and 1900s who went overseas and tried to build churches with stained glass windows, and they imported stained glass from England in order to build a church building in the middle of Africa somewhere, which was completely inappropriate and very expensive as well, because they had let what the churches looked like shape what they thought their mission was, and also that affected who they thought Jesus was, rather than actually taking who Jesus is to shape their missiology and what the churches looked like, which meant that actually, I mean, Jesus didn't build a church with stained glass windows, did he? So that meant that they could just meet people outside, as Jesus did, in fact. So I've put here an NB as well, take note. In pioneering mission, there is a feedback loop. In other words, we're actually finding out new things about Jesus as we engage in his mission. So our missiology is not only shaping our ecclesiology, but also sometimes our Christology. And that can feel quite threatening to some people. But actually, it ever was thus. The more you journey with God, the more you learn about God. It's just inevitable, I would maintain. Anyway, don't let that bamboozle you too much. Here's Paul talking about the reason why he thinks fresh expressions of church are so important for us to engage with.
It really came together when I walked down Brick Lane one Sunday, and there was, huge numbers of people walking up and down Brick Lane, and there were, things like tarot card reading going on, and there were Muslim evangelists out in the street proclaiming that, come and hear about the true Islam that we hear about in the media, but what struck me that there was no Christian witness, because that is 11 o'clock on a Sunday, or Christians are in church, and not that that's a bad thing, but it did raise a question to me of what's happening in the rest of the world when Christians are just all gathered together, and that combined with that, most of the people that were walking up and down Brick Lane were people who are in their 20s and 30s. So it really began to think about, okay, how do we do church for completely unchurched people? What would that look like? And to think about, what does church look like for this generation?
That video from Paul is on the GODSEND app, as you can see the reference to it there. GODSEND, you look under Overview and Reasons and you'll find Paul there. So if you want to share it with anyone. So here's a picture of the Fresh Expressions journey, and this is the journey that we have found that people usually go on when they start to create a fresh expression of church. The journey always begins with listening, and it's a double kind of listening. It's listening to the culture of the people that you are engaging with, or that God is bringing to your attention, and also listening to God. Sometimes listening to God in those people and what they're saying to you. It's very likely that God will speak to you through those people without their even knowing it. So it's about listening, first of all, and that's probably the most important stage in this journey. And it's not that you just listen for a while and then you stop listening. You listen all the way along this journey, really. And so you can see there's a blue arrow around the outside of this cycle, and that is to represent prayer and connection with the wider church. And those two things are ongoing throughout this whole journey, along with the listening element. So typically what happens is that we listen to those that we're engaging with. We want to love them and find ways of showing that love to those people and to receive love from them as well. It's a two-way street. Often, as we engage in mission, we think we've got so much to offer, and yet we find out that others love us and want to share that love with us as well. So love, listen, and then love. And then out of that listening and loving, then gradually over time, a community may form. Not at this stage necessarily a Christian community, but a sense of community amongst perhaps a group of friends or a group of people who are engaging with each other on a deeper level than just as acquaintances. And then as the life of that community deepens, there come opportunities sometimes to share Jesus with people in that community. Those relationships have become deeper, and it seems appropriate sometimes to share your faith and how it impacts your life among those people. And as you do that, some of those people may respond and actually want a piece of that. And so then gradually over time, something that you might call church could begin to form. And that's the Christian community emerging out of this initial community. And then if you're growing a fresh expression of church, in the DNA of the whole thing is that you will repeat the whole process again. And so that new church that you've grown over many years perhaps, or maybe quite quickly, depending on the context and everything, will then be looking to repeat the listening, loving, community, sharing Jesus church pattern again and again in lots of different environments and cultures. Let's listen to Andrea now, talking a bit about how she went about this in one particular way and with her friend Ben.
So I'm Andrea Campanale. I run Sacred Space Kingston in Kingston upon Thames. Started working with steampunks in Kingston about 3 or 4 years ago. So we have a friend called Ben who's a Christian and involved in steampunks, and he puts on events at a pub in New Malden, which is where I live. He's been building relationships and being part of that community for a number of years. He's very creative, he loves putting on events, so he's put on this steampunk Surrey convivial for the last few years, and he invited me to come along, and I do Ruach card readings at the steampunk events. And I think why I was invited was to bring some kind of spiritual element to those events. That it was great that Ben was building relationships and he was putting on events that people love to come to, and he was able to share his faith, but also he wanted some kind of contextualized way of helping other people to talk about what they believed and to think about how Christianity might interact with that in a way that felt natural and relevant in that kind of environment. So over the years, I've kind of encouraged Ben, and I've said to Ben, don't bring steampunks to Sacred Space Kingston, but actually try and develop something indigenous amongst steampunks. So, you know, what would discipleship be like for steampunks? What is worship like for steampunks? And to get Ben and other Christians who are involved in that culture to really work and to develop something that is genuinely contextual for that community of people.
And here is Andy talking about Sorted, which may be a slightly more familiar context for some of you.
My name's Andy Milne, and here we are in Bradford, West Yorkshire, and I am involved in a fresh expression of church called Sorted, which works amongst young people, young adults and young families. We began pioneering Sorted by getting involved in secondary schools and building relationships with young people. As the relationships formed, we formed an open group where there'd be lots of games and activities, and lots of testimony about Jesus shared with the young people. As the young people started to ask questions and became interested in wanting to know more, we began several small groups where they could ask questions, explore the Christian faith, and where we could model discipleship. Eventually we started a worship service which is by young people and for young people. And that was going well, and Sorted was taking shape. And then God really nudged us to start thinking about doing the whole thing again a couple of miles up the road with different young people. And we started to question what could be reproduced. How would it be different in a different context? Over the next 2 or 3 years, Sorted 2 began to take shape. New young people came to faith, and a new, fresh expression was born in a different area. And so Sorted is reproduced on 3 different occasions, with different young people in different contexts. 3 times here in Bradford, but also once in South London. And it's been exciting to see the differences each time this has happened.
So a really good example there from Bradford of Sorted, and all of these videos you can find on the GODSEND app. That one's under Repeat and Sorted if you want to see it again or show it to someone else. So here are some more questions for you. Are you already involved in growing a fresh expression of church? If not, is it something you might consider? What is your vocation in relation to this? And what do you think God is inviting your community towards? By which I mean either your church community or a community that you are part of may not be a church community. What is God inviting your community towards? These are questions that we can discuss in one way or another. I will find a way to do that, hopefully through the day. So don't lose them. I may put them up in some chat room or something so we can share our ideas. The truth is, though, that I believe we're no longer living in a Christian context in the UK. That ship has sailed. So our mission task is cross-cultural. We are engaging all the time with people in different cultures, not just in a Christian culture. And to follow Jesus means to go to those beyond the church, to meet them on their territory. Jesus bothered to leave heaven after all, and he came to earth, which is our territory. He bothered to do that. So that's our pattern that we must follow. He left the synagogue and walked through the streets and the fields. That's everyday people's territory in his day, and I believe strongly that we must follow this pattern. That's what Fresh Expressions of Church is all about doing, is rediscovering what it means to follow Jesus in going to those beyond the church, the current reach of the church. This is a brilliant quote from Bishop Graham Cray, who used to be the bishop's advisor for Fresh Expressions. In the New Testament, boundary-crossing mission led to new problems of unity, which the church then had to address and resolve. That is the right order. The mission to the Gentiles was not put on hold because it created problems for the unity of the church, nor because all types of Gentiles were not being evangelized at the same time. When previously unreached people find faith, it is the church's task to resolve the new challenges to unity which have been created by the missionary spirit. This came about, it was a response partly to some of the backlash when Fresh Expressions of Church were advocated for so strongly by Archbishop Rowan Williams. And there was a bit of a backlash from people who didn't agree we should be doing this. They thought we should just be carrying on running the church in the same way that we've always run it and not worrying about adapting to the cultural changes around us at all. But as Bishop Graham points out, the church has always done this. It's always reached out to those around it, and it's always adapted in order to connect with people from different cultures. We've looked at many examples in the Bible of that already in our previous sessions, thinking about Paul in Acts, going to the altar to the unknown God and how he managed to find a way of speaking with those people and cultures around him. I'm just going to put these statistics up for a bit, just so that you know they're there. These are some statistics from a report called The Day of Small Things, which is posted on our Moodle if you want to read more depth about them. And if numbers are your thing, this may be good for you to see. I think actually since this report, it's maybe been shown that slightly more women tend to lead Fresh Expressions of Church than men, rather than men and women being absolutely equally likely to be leading them. But there's some statistics for you. And encouragements for Fresh Expressions of Church. They travel light and they release the creativity that God is already inspiring in people. They're more deeply incarnational and enculturated. They're adaptable. They're always contextually relevant. They're never hit and hope. I don't know if you heard that phrase. Sometimes it has felt in the past like the church has gone out to do mission and it's a bit of a hit and hope kind of situation. But because Fresh Expressions are all about listening first, you're not just putting on an event or a service or a mission and hoping that people will come to it. You're actually listening to the people first with some depth and loving them and engaging with them and building relationship with them, so that then when something does start to grow, it's growing from them rather than being done to them, as it were. They are invitational and have an attitude of listening, as I've just said, really. The other thing about Fresh Expressions is they more often share decision-making a bit more effectively than most churches might, rather than having the hierarchical sort of structures that we tend to have in the Anglican Church, where the vicar sometimes knows best, allegedly, or we might dispute that. They're experimental as well, so sometimes the experiment doesn't work, And I would say our response is not to stop experimenting, but to keep experimenting, because that's what our vocation is as a church in this era. It's going back to Phyllis Tickle's idea that we're in this massive epoch of change at the moment. So we must experiment to find the way forward. Most fresh expressions aim to reproduce in the medium to long term, and most people growing fresh expressions have really sacrificially given up things that would be much more comfortable and easy for them to do in order to pioneer something new. And that is a real gift of love that we must pay attention to. I believe it's really from God. So all of those things mean that fresh expressions will be more easily sustainable longer term than many other types of church. And most people who are involved in fresh expressions of church will have found this pandemic easier to adapt to because they already travel light, they already don't have a building, they already have had to think through how to use online ways of communicating because that's the world that we're in. So in some ways they're better equipped than most to handle whatever's thrown at us by this pandemic, interestingly. Let me play you another video from the GODSEND app, and this is a little animation.
If you're trying to grow a new Christian community, how will you know when you've succeeded? Some people think a proper church would last for decades. In other words, it's all about being durable. But think of the first church that ever grew in Jerusalem. In terms of history, its life was minuscule. The church ended less than 40 years after it started, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. And yet it was one of the most fruitful churches in history. Its members started new Christian communities in Judea, Samaria, Cyprus, Antioch, and all over the place. They gave birth to the worldwide church that's still going now. Look at today's churches. Some have lasted a very long time, but are they all still thriving? Churches can keep going for decades, but keeping going doesn't necessarily make them fruitful. If you want to see fruit, don't aim for durability, pray for reproduction. Help new Christians to copy the first followers of Jesus and to grow new Christian communities themselves.
And then just to finish with, I want to play another video from GODSEND, which is a follow-on regarding Paul and Kahila, the cafe that he set up in Brick Lane in London to respond to the challenge as he saw it in that context. This is a beautiful thing about what has grown as a result of that cafe beginning.
For me, Kahila is a God-given dream that has come to fruition, and now I want to be there to help other people to live out their God-given dream. And so when somebody comes to me and says, hey, you know, I've got a real heart to work with women, vulnerable women in the local area, and I want to be there to kind of support and encourage that, rather than thinking about, well, that's good, but what are you like at worship leading, or what are you like at youth ministry, because I'm trying to grow this church and I need a youth team and I need a worship team. But it's like, okay, how do I release you then into what God's called you to do? And so I said, okay, well, look, we'll employ you a day a week to just go and start working with these women and then see what happens. And within 3 months, Alice comes back and she shares the need of these vulnerable women, and what they really need is an alternative means of income. And I thought, well, look, we sell stupid amounts of cake. Why don't we set up a bakery? And I knew nothing about setting up a bakery, but then I knew nothing about setting up a coffee shop, and but that didn't stop us. So that's kind of why we ended up moving forward and setting up a bakery. And women are going on these life employability schemes that we put together and seeing lives transformed. Very similar, again, we employed Emily to set up a safe house for survivors of human trafficking, because she'd come back from Bangkok, saw that as a huge issue in London. So I said, well, okay, well, let's what do they need? And she said they need a place, safe home to live in. So I said, well, let's do that. Let's raise money and let's get a safe house. And then Jo, she had a vision to work with women in prisons doing mentoring and education. So again, I said, well, I'll employ you a day a week to go and do that. And I think that's the kind of model that we want to keep rolling out. That how do we, as people begin to catch a vision for what God is calling them to do, we don't want to just go, okay, that's nice. It's like, okay, no, we really want to invest in that and release them, and in that, the kingdom is expanded.
And the wonderful thing about Kahila is that the City of London have been so impressed by everything that's grown from it that they're asking them now to start another cafe. I think they started maybe a couple of years ago a second cafe in a slightly different location in London. And so it's interesting how even from the wider world you start to get this positive response happening to the growing of the kingdom of heaven through these means. Okay, so that's the end of our second session.